Good evening, everyone. Today, I'm Sajid Inamdar. I'm a PhD first year student in SIS JNU. The music is still coming. Mayur. Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Sajid Inamdar. I'm first year PhD student in SIS JNU. I welcome you for today's talk. Today, Egypt is in different. Egypt is in news for some different reason. There's some echo. Hello, Mayur. There is some echo. Hello everyone. Today Egypt is in news because the Suez Canal has been blocked for more than 10 days now and has disrupted the trade and traffic. But now, today evening, we are here to talk about Nawal al-Sadawi and her legacy in Egyptian feminist movement. As you might be knowing, last Sunday, the feminist giant, feminist icon, died at the age of 89 in Cairo. She was author of more than 55 books, and she was also a trained doctor, novelist, sociologist, and an activist. She's perhaps most known for her 1970 book Women and Sex, and also for her other books, The Hidden Face of Evil. Then she was a fierce activist who rallied against like evil practices such as female genital mutilation and against religious conservatism and the clergy. she also founded Arab Women's Solidarity Association. She was also part of Arab Association for Human Rights and all this. Perhaps today's talk, we are very glad that Professor Ramki agreed to talk on this subject at a very short notice. This topic reminded me of my MA days when Professor Ramki used to teach us about all the social movements in the region and all these things. So whenever this name used to come before us, Fatima Marnesi, Rita Buloka, Namal Sadawi. So this name were like totally new to us, and so like uh, perhaps we could have never thought it like the intellectual movements. Egypt is better known as like intellectual hub of Arab world. So we could never thought that there were so many progressive movements in the region. So it was his Ramki sir's lecture that opened like large avenue for us. And so we are very glad that he agreed to talk on the subject at very short notice. Uh, and perhaps Professor Ramki sir does not need introduction to the crowd in jail because his courses are very popular and uh, he's perhaps best known for his course Intellectual Traditions in Arab World. So like which is very popular and like need not need any formality. But before joining KNU, Professor Ramki has taught in Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, and Jamia Millia Islamic Institute. And now he has been in Center for West Asian Studies for nearly a decade. So without wasting much more time, I give the floor to Professor Ramki sir so that he can talk on his. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
I hope you can hear me. Okay. Thank you, Sajid, for that introduction. Thank you, all the organizers, for inviting me to speak on Nawal al-Saadawi. For me, personally, this is a name that has lived with me in my adult life, in my academic life, because her influence on the study of the West Asian region, her influence on the issues concerning the Arab world has been an important part of our own, understanding of the region from a bottom-up approach. Today we are remembering an important personality who has been in the forefront of the feminist movements in the global south. She has been a very significant writer, both as a novelist and as a writer on a variety of issues which are of our concern today. She has been an active human rights activist, and her involvement in a variety of social movements have been exemplary. She has been a person with lots of energy, even when in her 80s, she used to be very active in a variety of movements. In 2011, when the Tahrir Square movement, the Arab uprisings were, becoming so important in the history of contemporary social movements, she has been there to participate in the movement against dictatorship, demanding democratic transition. She stood with the younger generation, and her life was celebrated in Tahrir Square by the youth, particularly by the students, and particularly by young women gathered there, because for them, Nawal al-Saadawi was somebody who showed the path of resistance against dictatorship and against the ills of contemporary capitalism. She described herself as a feminist with a strong emphasis on a feminist perspective of both of her life and of her work. She also described herself as a socialist. The usual comment that she makes is that I stand for structural transformation. She asserts those words very regularly. And as a writer, a creative writer, she has been central in, making the Arab women's writing popular across the world. Egypt has a significant history of women's writing starting from the 60s with Latifa al-Sayad's work, the famous novel, The Open Door. And Nawal Saadawi ignited a whole lot of new enthusiasm in the field of women's writing. And Saadawi's books, her novels like Woman at Point Zero, describing the life of Firdaus, who was a sex worker jailed for murdering her pimp, and the life of Firdaus was described in Woman at Point Zero by Nawal Saadawi in such a manner that a discussion on matters such as sex work could be undertaken in the public realm. Until then, that was not possible to that extent. Because of the power of her writing, such issues became prominent themes in women's writing in the Arab world, in Egypt in particular. She has also led the way for other feminist writers, creative writers in particular, to expand the domains of interest. Notable among them is Nawal Saadawi's own position on the neoliberal transformation that Egypt was witnessing from Anwar al-Sadat's days. Because he was introducing the new open door economic policy, and the ill effects of which were visible in the 80s and 90s. He started the neoliberal economic policies in Egypt in the mid-70s. So much of Nawal al-Saadawi's and other feminist writers' work was not only of describing the lives of people in Egypt, but also critically looking at the effects the social effects, the cultural effects of neoliberal transformation of Egypt. And Nawal Saadawi contributed to that kind of a thinking, not only in her essays and books, but also in her novels in a considerable extent. Nawal Saadawi belongs to a long tradition of feminist movements in Egypt. Whether it's Aisha Taimuria in the 19th century, or it's Huda Sharawi and Dr. Doria Shafiq in the 20th century, she comes from a lineage of women's struggle and feminist thinking in Egypt, which has a long, long history. It was in the late 19th century when the interaction with Europe and European modernity was becoming significant. The results of Muhammad Ali's reforms in the 19th century Egypt, and then emergence of Islamic modernism under the leadership of Muhammad Abduh and others. There was a milieu in the late 19th century where newer thinking was taking shape, and the questions regarding women's education, or the lack of it during that time, the requirements to have legal reforms in order to assert women's rights. These issues, education and legal reforms, were issues for women's struggle in Egypt in the 19th century itself. Late 19th century and particularly early part of the 20th century, we saw the emergence of significant feminist activism and the founding of the Egyptian Feminist Union, that was the name, the EFU, which was founded in 1923 by Huda Sharawi, and the Egyptian Feminist Union was also an important step in the direction of social transformation of Egypt, because already there was a strong anti-British nationalist movement was there, and the women participants and leaders in the nationalist movement felt that they not only have to participate in the national movement, they also should have a women-centered organizational setup established there, because they knew that a male-centric nationalist movement need not necessarily be addressing women's issues properly. So there was a kind of love-hate relationship between Egyptian nationalism and Egyptian feminism in the early part of the 20th century. The impact that Egyptian Feminist Union had was very significant, because the women could come in a big manner in the public realm, attain newer opportunities for educational improvement, and then come into various professions. In the 1940s and 50s, we have seen organizations like the Bint an-Nil, important feminist organization in Egyptian history, led by Dr. Doria Shafiq, whose struggles, along with that of Egyptian Feminist Union, gave Egyptian women the right to vote, and again pressurized the government. Doria Shafik had to go for hunger strike many times in order to establish citizenship rights and women's rights in the constitutional process. And you could see that under Dr. Doria Shafik's leadership, the feminist movement was becoming much more middle class oriented. Earlier, Huda Sharawi's movement, etc., were much more elitist in character, but that the women from ordinary households could now become part of such a women's movement in Egypt. Dr. Nawal al-Saadawi comes to two waves of Egyptian feminism, the Egyptian Feminist Union of the 1920s and the Bint al-Nil tradition of the 1940s and 50s. Dr. Nawal Saadawi's activism became very important in the 70s, but was crystallized with the formation of the Arab Women's Solidarity Association, which Sajid hinted at. And what Dr. Nawal Saadawi was doing was to connect Egyptian feminism in the broader realm of Arab feminism, so that there is a sisterly connection with women's organization across the Arab world, across individual national boundaries. And that's a very significant aspect of her thinking about feminism in the Arab world in general. And I remember many of the Arab Women's Solidarity Association's meetings, the presentations in those initial meetings, yearly meetings, where feminists from across the Arab world, and not only from the other Arab world, but from outside also participated. And the reports of the Arab Women's Solidarity Association meetings were published in the form of books. Those papers were very significant in developing an Arab feminist perspective from diverse angles, actually, of people coming and interacting with each other from diverse contexts within the Arab world. Dr. Nawal Saadawi's famous book, The Hidden Face of Eve, provided a broad conceptual canvas in which Arab women's issues and Arab women's identity itself could be discussed in a much more systematic manner. Until such a work, much of the feminist discussions were centered around issues within each national boundary. And Nawal Saadawi's significant contribution through writing Hidden Face of the Eve was that these histories of feminist movements across the Arab world could be brought into one umbrella so that Arab women could understand their heritage of movements and then, take pride in the way they acted in history, and also can mobilize themselves strategically in a combined manner across individual national boundaries within the Arab world. Hidden Face of Eve became a classic work in not only in Arab feminism, but also in international feminism as such, and particularly very significant for feminist understanding from the global south, because how these non-Western contexts themselves have been a very fertile ground for critical feminist thinking and organizing. And it was incumbent upon Dr. Sahdevi to give a narration of such a rich history and provide enough resources for feminist activists of the newer generations. And that classic work served that purpose to a great extent. Her work in the 1970s, particularly, her significant initial work, Al-Marra Al-Jinns, Woman and Sex, was extremely significant because she opened up a large terrain of discussions on subjects which were almost taboos during those times. And her work on woman and sex was, based not only, on her experience in understanding women's activism and feminism in the Arab world, but also from her own experience as a doctor. And she has been, as a person who herself in her childhood underwent FGM, she wrote against those practices of female genital mutilation from both the perspective of a feminist and also from the perspective of a doctor. And such writings contributed to giving courage to many women activists and writers to come up and speak about the unspeakable of those times. So she gave voice to many, gave the language to many feminists to put forward their concerns in a politically conscious feminist manner. And that's a very significant contribution of Dr. Sahdevi. Her works, whether it's, the Circling Song, for example, describing the creative writing there was providing us a glimpse into Egyptian rural life, particularly of Egyptian children, and not only the innocence of childhood, but also of the tremendous obstacles that rural children in Egypt faced in growing up in the transformational context of both economies and politics. You could see that, dictatorship was becoming stronger and stronger, whether it's the role of the military from Nasser's time itself, and also in particular from Sadat's times, how the political milieu dominated by dictatorial regimes of Anwar al-Sadat and Hosni Mubarak, and the neoliberal economic transformation of Egypt, authoritarianism and neoliberalism was creating tremendous problems for ordinary people's lives, and particularly with regard to women's lives, women's employment, opportunities for work, and the very conception of the role of women. Newer ways of asserting patriarchy in the during these times of open door economic policies, and how the surveillance state in Egypt was being strongly established, particularly during the times of Hosni Mubarak. Whether it was Sadat's regime or Mubarak's regime, Dr. Nawal Saadawi has always been in the opposition to these regimes, resisted many of their policies, and because of her criticism of several government policies and the very nature of dictatorship in Egypt, she was put in jail in the 1980s, early 80s, suffered all kinds of pressures and attacks on her at several junctures. And, she has been also an ardent critic of the religious right in Egypt. So the religious right on the one hand and the authoritarian regime on the other, both of these entities found Dr. Saadawi as an enemy. And therefore she faced several problems, both from the state and from the religious right. This is extremely significant. I myself had certain level of personal experience because I fixed an interview with Dr. Nawal Saadawi. That was in early 1993. I lived in Egypt during 92, 93, working on Egyptian feminism. So she was one of the most important persons I had to see. I already met many of the important women's writers like Salwa Bakr, Fidel Usman, Radwa Ashur, and many others. But meeting her was very important. And, she gave me a date to meet her in her apartment. It was not too far from Cairo University where I was staying. But on one day morning, when I woke up, read the Egyptian Gazette, which is a government-controlled newspaper, there was a big news that Dr. Nawal Saadawi is issued with a death threat. So I thought, what is this? I walked up to her apartment and saw that the whole apartment was surrounded by police. And a few days later, I could contact Dr. Sharif Hateta. Dr. Hateta was then Dr. Sadavi's husband, and Dr. Hedeta has been the most important translator of most of Dr. Nawal Sadavi's works, whether her creative writing or her essays and other books. And they were also comrades in political activism, etc. So he told me that Nawal Sadavi had to leave the country after that death threat because it's very difficult for them to judge who is issuing the death threat. Because Dr. Sadavi cannot be sure whether it's from the religious right or from the government itself. The government will blame the religious elements so that it can have its way in suppressing oppositional voices. So you are between the devil and the deep sea. I could see that, and I could not interview her during that time because of all these developments. That's when she went to the United States, started teaching at Duke University. Duke University is having a memorial meeting tomorrow, I understand. So she started a teaching career after that, even though until then it was not an important aspect of her life. Being a doctor, she was also the head of the Egyptian Public Health Department. When she was removed from that position after the publication of Woman and Sex. And so those, the life of a doctor and the life of a writer and the life of an activist, a further element was added after these death threats, that she became a university teacher as well for some time in her life in the 90s. She returned back to Egypt in 1996, going off and coming back, but then stayed, and we have seen her in the 2000s when she was an important face of the Tahrir Square uprising against Mubarak's dictatorship. She has been a very important feminist thinker, activist, writer who provided a social basis, an intellectual basis on which newer generation could benefit. And her exemplary courage, in spite of all the death threats, etc. You should remember that in 92, when I arrived in Egypt, that was the week when Farag Foda, the famous Egyptian intellectual and the leader of the Egyptian Human Rights Organization, was killed in daylight on the streets. So being a human rights activist and a feminist activist at that point of time in Egypt was difficult. It's unlike many other situations. And she withstood all those pressures and lived a full life, as I said. 89, she was going to be 90. That's a good age to say goodbye. But we miss her particularly of her determination and courage. Many feminists I've seen in Egypt complaining about her because she is so assertive. That many voices within the feminist movement itself could not be heard because of her, dominant voice within the movement. But that denotes her own individuality and leadership position within the Egyptian and the Arab feminist movements, I'll stop with one more point. During the end of the International Women's Decade in 1985, you could see that there were lots of give and take between international feminist activists and organizations on the one hand, and Arab women's activists on the other. And there was a famous debate when few feminist leaders from across the world, led by famous feminist thinker and activist Angela Davis, they were coming to Egypt, and Nawal Saadawi was an important voice from the Arab side. And you could see the tussle between international feminist activists and the Egyptian feminists on the agendas of feminist movement itself. Egyptian feminists have been arguing for a contextually specific agenda of feminist movements, while the international side was talking more in terms of global agendas of feminist movements. The Egyptian feminists were asserting on women's rights, on the question of women's work, on the question of legal reforms, and therefore fuller assertions of women's citizenship, etc. These were not the priorities for many international feminist leaders, etc., at that point of time. And therefore, it was a good discussion because the international group also learned a whole lot from the experiences and the leadership provided by Dr. Nawal Saadawi in putting forth alternative agendas from our own context. That's extremely significant. She is, as many people say, an icon for feminists across the world now. When I started studying about her, following her works, etc., she was supposedly a controversial figure, within quotes. It's good to see that now people recognize how those controversies that she created were actually for the benefit of progressive change. I salute her, and her memory, I'm sure, will inspire newer generations to fight for justice and to fight for women's rights in particular. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello. Thank you, sir, for your exposition on the Egyptian feminist movement and the legacy of Nawal al-Saadawi. From your talk, we got to know how she was caught up between, from one side on the religious extremists and other side on the army establishment, the dictatorship, and other things. So now we'll be opening the floor for the question and answer session, sir. We already have some questions in our comment box. Vipul is asking what feminists in India can learn from Nawal al-Saadawi's experience in Egypt, particularly in the times of fundamentalist forces in power. Hello, sir. Hello, sir. Are you able to hear us, sir? Hello. So can you hear us, sir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. We can hear you now. We can hear you.
Okay. And so, Sajid, can you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. Yes, I will repeat the question. Yes, sir. Sir, I have one question from Vipul. He's asking, what feminists in India can learn from Nawal al-Sadwi's experience in Egypt, particularly in the times of fundamentalist? I think there's some problem at sir's end.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Again, a problem of connection.
Yes, sir. Yes. So can I repeat the question or?
Yeah, no, I understood. Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Anything more? I can take one or two more and
Sir,
answer to them.
another question is like in same vein. We have a question for some feminists. Religion is a barrier for establishment of gender equality. What is your views about it? Is there any role of Nawal al-Saadawi in Indian context? Again, similar question like
Okay.
religion.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, she faced, as I said earlier, challenges from both the government side and from far-right organizations in the Egyptian context. Certain, not all, certain quarters of the religious establishment was opposed to her positions on many things. But that doesn't mean that that opposition was some kind of a position which was, stagnant. No, it was a dynamic kind of relationship. In the sense, when she was in the Tahrir Square, many of the Muslim Brotherhood activists who joined the movement, went to her and told her that they also read her works and inspired by by her, even though officially, they were at loggerheads with each other. So, people who love literature, read things, wanted to show the contemporary worth of the Arabic language, etc. They were irrespective of their religious positions. They had a certain level of respect for Dr. Nawal Saadawi. And this was also true with the jail experience as well, because during her time in jail and many other times when she was involved with questions of prisoners, many times, the problems faced by, prisoners from the Muslim Islamic organizations of various kinds, she has to take up those issues. As I said, as a human rights person, that was very important. So the point is that at one level, she was opposed to what was in the 70s and 80s language called the fundamentalists. She was opposed to that, but she was also having channels of communication open with them. And you could see that even though there was big conflict that you could see, later when the Islamic feminist thinking became much more prominent in the Arab world, the people like Nawal Saadawi were not viewed as an enemy of the Islamic feminists, rather as an ally. Even though they were speaking from very different standpoints. And the second question there, the role of religion in as far as feminist movements were concerned, it's important in the Arab context to recognize the growing influence of Islamic feminism. And it is in that context Nawal Saadawi and others became secular feminists because you have new Islamic feminists becoming a significant voice. There is a role for feminists to interpret religious texts, what in the Islamic tradition is known as ijtihad, the interpretation applying human rationality. That opportunity for interpretation is there. And from a patriarchal reading of it in many conventional ways of the religious tradition, what Islamic feminists have done is to have a feminist reading of religious texts and tradition. And that created a large chunk of very significant new knowledge and new ways of feminists and the religious section interacting with each other in an organic manner. So that has to be noted in the context in which we are now discussing Arab and Egyptian feminism and Dr. Saadawi's feminism in particular. Yes, they were not from the same standpoint at all. The Islamic feminists and Saadawi's Arab socialist kind of feminism. But as I said, there were different voices within the large umbrella of feminist movement. You're mute.
Yes. In the same context, we see in India, there is a debate upon like whether to look at women's issue or Muslim women's issue through secular lens or through the like what you said about the feminist interpretation of religious text. So in the long run, how do you see which one will be better way of looking at women's issue, and how Nawal Al-Sadwi's views or her works will help in this regard?
No, there is a problem in comparing our contemporary context with what Nawal al-Saadawi and others were facing in Egypt or in the broader Arab context. What we see in India, for example, that kind of extreme far-right assertion, Hindutva assertion for that matter, those things are by no means simple religious assertions. They are political assertions of tending towards fascist tendencies to a large extent, not merely authoritarianism. It is authoritarian, but much more than that, ideological in character. Sadat and Mubarak were not ideological except their neoliberal inclinations, etc. But here it's much more ideologically oriented and much more powerful in that sense. Whether one should make it as a religious discussion, etc., is up to you. But these things should be treated in its political essence. So my point would be we are comparing two very different contexts.
So we have another question. Can you explain more about Nawal Al-Saadawi's views on Western feminism and her views of Orientalist discourses?
Okay. Western, yes. I've already pointed out certain debates and disagreements with, feminists coming from outside of Egypt, particularly Western feminists. And I've talked about the difference in the agenda setting itself, which is important, that whether one is talking about feminist agendas that is suitable for the context in which we live, that's very important. And Nawal Saadawi was well aware of that contextual requirement. But she has had an important aspect of certain universalistic notions that were significant in her feminist ideological position. Whether it's her socialist orientation, her insistence that gender questions should be addressed, in unison with questions of class. So gender and class is very significant as far as Nawal Saadawi is concerned. And there is certain notions of human rights which she accepts as something that is valid across national boundaries. And in that sense, there is a global perspective in Nawal Saadawi as far as feminist understanding is concerned. But at the same time, particular way of understanding Arab feminist histories, Egyptian feminist traditions, and projecting an Arab and Egyptian identity from a feminist standpoint was also significant for her. So it's a kind of give and take thing, and at the same time, an assertion of a contextual identity as far as Egyptian and Arab feminists are concerned. That question also implies whether the kind of imperialist uses of feminism, for example, of the question of veil, for example, or the way, what Laila Abu Lughat calls saving Muslim women from their men, that kind of an imperialist notion coming from the West that has to be resisted, and Nawal Saadawi also talked about it and called for an opposition to those kinds of dominant notions, utilizing feminism for political purposes by contemporary imperialist powers. So she was aware of that, and many people asked in several interviews, you could see those questions being raised. And therefore, there is an anti-imperialist position as far as even the understanding of feminism is concerned.
Sir, we have another question. Sir, how does her politics, her views got reflected in her novels?
We mentioned a few examples of that. How Firdaus, the sex worker in Woman at Point Zero, that central character is extremely significant because here we are talking about transformations in the economic system and how lives of women are affected by these transformations, how women find agency in determining their own life. And in this case, with Firdaus, she has to kill the pimp for that matter. And whether in the turbulent context in which Nawal Saadawi and her character Firdaus lives, there is no easy resolution to these conflicts. That's where you see Woman at Point Zero. She is going to the gallows to be killed. But that assertion of agency is important in this context, where you find that opposing that kind of extremely violent patriarchal domain of controlling women's bodies and their sex, that kind of context, the belief was that this cannot be overcome by a woman. But it could be challenged, and then you can annihilate the elements that stand against you. And that's why those kinds of works became important social texts, which stood for certain ways of reworking patriarchy in those societies. And as I've said, many of the descriptions, the language itself used for such works opened up new ways of articulating women's agency in society. And therefore, it's extremely politically significant in that sense.
So this is the last question. I was just curious to know where did she stand when we know that she was in Tahrir Square, she rallied people. So where does she stand? If you see in her last decade, in the in how Egyptian revolution turned out to be. Muslim Brotherhood first, and then the military dictatorship. What was her position on in that last decade of like her life towards Sisi?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one chapter. Her participation in the Tahrir Square events was very significant, as I've already mentioned. She was, many younger people went to her, saluted her for her courage of standing up. And she thought that, her dreams of women's activism with a feminist consciousness is now, that torch is handed over to the new generation who was struggling for their rights and their democratic aspirations during the Arab uprising. The problem that came up was the removal of the Morsi regime. Her own conventional criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. And therefore, you could see that somewhere the coming of a secular regime was thought to be preferable to the Muslim Brotherhood regime by many people, including Dr. Saadawi, which I think was a mistake by her, because it was the removal of a democratically elected regime, and it paved way for the military to come back and establish the dictatorship again. These were the last years of the last decade of her life, much weaker, and lots of things happening. In 2010, she divorced Dr. Heketa, a partner for quite a long period of time. And, I could see some of these personal issues also affecting her, and obviously of health issues in her 80s was again another matter. So her position on that transition in Egypt was something that I should see as not befitting her own contributions otherwise. But we are nobody to assess her successes and failures from her own personal positions. But for us, what is important is what she has left us with. Not only the her activism, but also the works that she has given us. And there are very few feminist activists like her who could inspire several generations now. And I'm sure that her legacy will continue in future.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir, for your exposition on the Egyptian feminist movement and the legacy of Nawal al-Saadawi. We are very glad that you could take out time Sunday evening and at a very short notice. And I'm sure personally I was very enriched by your talk, and I'm sure like our the people who joined us in this talk will found this talk very helpful. And we will all agree that Nawal al-Saadawi's legacy will be remembered for many more years to come, for her contribution to the feminist discourses. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the talk and you had something to gain from it. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.